Welcome to NucleCast, the official podcast of the ANWA Deterrence Center. Each week, we bring you leading experts for a lively discussion on topics related to strategic nuclear deterrence. Our host is Dr. Adam Lowther, Director of Strategic Programs at the National Strategic Research Institute. The views of the hosts and the guests are their own.
Hello and welcome into our latest edition of NucleCast. Of course, I am your host, Adam Lowther, and today I have with me Sam Wilson. He is a senior policy analyst at the Aerospace Corporation, where he covers topics like hypersonic weapons, nuclear command and control, and related space issues. Of course, he used to work for a government agency called the Government Accountability. Am I getting that right? The Government
right.
Accountability Office, where he was also an analyst related to some of these similar topics. And he is, of course, a graduate of the University of Virginia and its Batten School. I actually have a friend that works at the Batten School. So,
oh, you do?
So it's a great place, beautiful place. So welcome into NucleCast, Sam.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here, Adam. Thanks for having me.
So today we're going to talk about hypersonic weapons, and you wrote a paper not long ago where you laid out sort of four schools of thought. It's a paper that's available on the Aerospace website. So after we talk, if you, the listeners, are interested, go to the Aerospace website, Google Sam Wilson, and you can see what he's written for the organization. So you mentioned that there were basically sort of four schools of thought that move sort of from the right to the left. Could you maybe give us an introduction to your four schools of thought and the basic tenets of each?
Yeah. Thanks, Adam. Great question. So, and it just, as brief background, I think one reason why this is a very think tanky paper, and we've had a couple papers on missile issues, technical papers, budget papers, and then this, again, more think tanky, how do you understand the debate? And I think, one reason why I was really interested in this is just that it's a hard debate to sort out, I think, from the outside, right? Like the views on hypersonic weapons, I think, really frequently go to extremes. And what I found, and I did, about 2 years of interviews and literature review alongside the technical work that we were doing on this topic. And what I found was that people's views on hypersonic weapons, on their technical capabilities, were really tied to their strategic views, right? It was really hard to separate, people's sense of what should be the military objectives that we focus on vis-a-vis Russia and China, versus their technical opinion about whether hypersonic weapons are important for war. So the four schools of thought that I had are on this kind of continuum of strategic aims, right? And so, at kind of the first school, this was called Get Ahead, and this view was that hypersonic weapons are going to be extremely important for future war, and we should be deploying hundreds, if not thousands, of these systems, and we should be focusing on a lot of critical targets in Russia and China for conventional strike, and that's kind of that plays into why their views of hypersonic weapons is so important, because they're looking at a lot of mainland targets in Russia and China for targeting, and kind of one of the folks who I quote for this for this view is Dean Wilkening, who's written a lot about hypersonic weapons, and he's said, we need, perhaps, many hundred to many thousands of these systems, and he's called out which types of systems we should be thinking about developing hypersonic weapons for, and a lot of those are land-based systems, right? Like our systems within mainland Russia and China. I'll jump now to the fourth school, the kind of opposite school, which was avoid the race, and this view had the opposite views on both the technological position and the strategic position. So the technological position was that hypersonic weapons aren't a big deal, and they're not going to be important for future war. And the strategic position was we shouldn't be overly focused on these targets for conventional strike from mainland China and Russia. That putting hundreds to thousands of systems, attack systems in the Asia Pacific targeting these mainland targets in China is going to create more escalation risk, going to create more uncertainty. It's going to prompt China to pursue newer, scarier systems, and so on, right? And so you have this split that's not just technological, but it's strategic, right? It's like what you want to do with these systems. And that thread I found really interesting. I thought that was the most important takeaway of the paper and for understanding, this debate is just that, the technology, even when you're talking to technology experts, right, their views are also, especially when you talk about deployment, are also very much with strategic objectives in mind. And those strategic objectives are often unsaid, and you have to pull at them. And so this debate about hypersonic weapons is tangled. I'll just very briefly, the second and third schools, which I think are less important. I really think the first and the fourth are the most important. We're focused. The second school is focused on defense. How we need to develop more systems to track for tracking these types of capabilities and defending against these capabilities. And then the third school was we need to at least protect against conventional strikes on our homeland. We need to defend NC3. Make sure that if they're going to create have a strategic effect on the United States, that they have to use nuclear weapons. So we need to, harden, create more resiliency to protect against those systems. I saw a lot of important views in the second and third, but really, the first and the fourth, I think, are the most helpful for kind of understanding the debate.
Whenever I read the report, it made me think to. I was in a debate over a book I did a couple years ago, and it was roundly criticized in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist. And so I responded, and they responded. We had this tete-a-tete. Yeah. And in the end, what I ultimately came to was that there are very, this is really about worldviews.
Yeah.
And it's about, do you, what I would call a traditional Judeo-Christian worldview that man is a fallen creature and there's evil in the world, versus sort of the Kantian idealist view where, humanity is neither good nor bad. It's all made, and then with the right, institutions, which then teach the right values, we can sort of eliminate, bad in the world. We can reshape the world to our liking. Lenin talked about this. He called it Soviet man, that he would remake human nature. And so I think as you talk about the first and fourth positions, it seems very much akin to the broader debate, which I equate mostly to the discussion over nuclear. And, is that, do you see a world full of evil, and do you look at the Russians and the Chinese and say they're bad? Or do you look at the world and you say, hey, we can make it good. We make changes and it'll be good. And it seems your hypersonic discussion in many respects sort of followed that, the tenor of that debate.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think you can make a lot of assumptions. You can make a lot of predictions about where folks view what folks view what they might view on hypersonic weapons just by the simple question of is the simple statement of someone saying I don't think China is a huge threat, right?
Yeah.
Versus someone saying I'm extremely I'm extremely hawkish on China, right? Like that sentence right there. I can make some assumptions and some predictions that are probably pretty close for some. Not everyone, right?
Sure.
And the paper does talk about there are important exceptions, and I kind of have that 2x2 for folks who are thinking about because these two questions are important, and I think most people, the answer to these two questions is yes or no. Those two questions being, should we be focusing on mainland targets with conventional strike systems in mainland China and Russia, and then do we think hypersonic weapons will be extremely important for future war? And almost everyone, the answer to those questions is either both yes or both no. But there are some exceptions, and those exceptions I think kind of illuminate where what the spectrum of sense is on with respect to our deploying hypersonic strike systems. But yeah, I think it's an interesting issue because I think it really, as you said, I think it ties into these broader questions. It ties into questions about what you think about the Cold War. It ties into questions about what you think about arms control, and what you think about arms races, right? Like all these views get kind of wrapped in, and I didn't even ask people about their view on the Cold War, but in these interviews, people just kind of interjected these questions about whether the Cold War was a good thing, was a bad thing, whether arms races can produce good outcomes, whether they're inherently bad, inherently dangerous. So it was particularly interesting.
I often find that the takes this concept of strategic stability. So everybody says, that's destabilizing, or we need to maintain strategic stability. And I say, can you define it for me? What is strategic stability? What would I measure against? And I've yet to get a good definition of strategic stability. What I do know is that whoever's speaking to me, anything they don't like is destabilizing. Anything they do like is stabilizing. And that's sort of the best definition of strategic stability. Strategic stability is the things I like. That's sort of the best definition I've ever gotten. And it seems that hypersonic, HGVs, whether they're, they come off of an ICBM or whether they're, air launched, that they're in many respects going to achieve sort of a similar status where whatever the outcome is, whether stability or instability, is going to be based on what I think. And so, it's sort of the nature of when you have something like nuclear, and hypersonics in many respects is a lot sort of where the cyber and space world are, where people can pontificate about a cyber war or a space war, but until you actually fight one, and then you have some data to then go back and essentially do the aerial bombing survey after World War II, and then you can say, Dohe wasn't quite right. We've never had that chance, and we've not had it with hypersonics. And, so we're speculating about space, cyber, hypersonics, quantum computing, all of these kinds of things. And so therefore it's quite challenging to actually sort of figure these things out.
Right. No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think, and this is why I wanted to dig into this, is that I think it's problematic. I think it's problematic when, you're absolutely right. In my interviews too, people use the same terms, strategic stability. They co-opted each other's terms, right? use them in fundamentally different ways. But I think it's really problematic when you have the strategic and the technological entangled like this, right? Because it's hard to have an honest debate, because folks have different strategic assumptions, they have different strategic ambitions, objectives, and so what's really, I think, misunderstood is the technological, and because it just keeps getting into these these discussions of principles and kind of what we want of the world, and how we view threats, and how we view competition with adversaries, right? And so I think it's we had a different paper that was about the missile threat environment, and that was a technical paper, and I just there's just so many misperceptions that exist, and those don't get as much attention as sort of these extremes of, oh, hypersonic weapons, this is just another purported missile gap, or this is the greatest military invention since the introduction of the longbow in the 100 Years' War, right? And so you have these. How does someone? How does Congress? How do people actually try to untangle when you have physicists, right? Physicists that are spent years studying hypersonic weapons, saying these incredibly different things, and I think that I mean, again, I think it's because of the strategic, and that makes it really hard to understand the technical. And in the meantime, we're not really dissecting a lot of the technical misperceptions that exist about the broader missile environment generally.
So we're about halfway through the show, and of course we have to take a break for our sponsors. So when we come back, I want you to give us a brief discussion of what you see as some of the biggest technical misperceptions. And then we can delve a little further into the differing views amongst the technical community. We'll be right back. This episode of Nuclecast is brought to you by the 15th Annual Nuclear Deterrence Summit. Come join Nuclecast at the summit on February 13th through 15th, 2023 at the Hyatt Regency Crystal City, Arlington, Virginia. Industry and government experts will be discussing management of the nuclear security complex, stewardship of the nuclear stockpile, arms control negotiations, and strategic policy. Stop by the Nuclecast booth to say hello. Executive producer Kimberly Charrington and I will be there interviewing guests for upcoming episodes. You can find a registration link to the Nuclear Deterrence Summit with a 15% discount on the Nuclecast website at anwadeter.org/Nuclecast. Okay, we're back. We are with Sam Wilson of the Aerospace Corporation, one of the nation's 5 or 6, I think it is, FFRDCs. That's your federally funded research and development corporations. And we are talking about hypersonic weapons. So, Sam, what are our technical misperceptions?
Yeah, and I'm going to talk less about technical misperceptions of hypersonic weapons and more about the broader missile environment, because I think it's hard to understand one without the other. So, as you mentioned, I was working on strategic force structure issues when I was on the congressional side, the Government Accountability Office. I was there for about 8 years, and then when I came to aerospace, continued that work, and I got to meet with some of our folks who had been doing technical work on this for a really long time. One of those is Steve Dunham, who had been working on a missile taxonomy for over 20 years, right? He's been doing this technical work on missiles for 3 decades. And we had this report out that was kind of arguing for a new missile taxonomy. And I think the problem is that there's this pervasive misperception that missiles generally fall into three categories. One being that they're ballistic, they're fast, but they're not maneuverable, right? They operate like just like you throwing a rock up in the air, and so they're it's a predictable parabolic trajectory, but they're fast. There are some people that kind of have issues with the speed, but let's just assume there's a basic understanding. Ballistic missiles are fast, but are not maneuverable. Then there's cruise missiles, which are maneuverable, but not fast, right? And that's the second category. And then there's this new thing, this niche thing, this hypersonic missiles that are fast and maneuverable. And this is why they're getting so much attention, and this is why they seem so threatening. And the problem, I think, with this is that these three categories are wrong. Before hypersonic weapons in quotations were deployed, even the small number of systems that you hear are deployed, we've had fast and maneuverable systems for a really long time, right? In the 80s, we had Pershing IIs that had maneuverable reentry vehicles. I think another example is just ICBMs. In the 1970s, you have ICBMs with multiple independent reentry vehicles, meaning that you could have the same missile that could target Atlanta and New York, right? So, I think a lot of the threat that is talked about with respect to hypersonic weapons is that, okay, we can detect the boost, we detect when they're launched, but we don't know where they're headed, and they're traveling very fast. That's correct, right? Like there's no technical misperceptions about that. What's wrong is that's different from a lot of other systems that exist and that have existed for a really long time. And so it's not what people are saying about hypersonic weapons that's necessarily wrong. Some of it is, but what's really wrong is people's frame of reference for what they're using. And I think this is because of a couple of reasons. One, people call a lot of things ballistic that aren't ballistic. We call things that are ballistic. I mean, Pershing IIs we called as ballistic. One example is China deployed DF-21D, which and DoD called this a ballistic missile that can target ships. Well, if anything can target ships, it's not ballistic, right? You're talking about that requires a sophistication and a level of maneuverability that you're not going to get from a purely ballistic missile. So a lot of the stuff that people talk about as ballistic is not. So in that paper that I mentioned, we surveyed 77 systems, and those were Russian, Chinese, North Korean, and Iranian. So not just Chinese and Russian, also North Korean and Iranian. And of those 77 systems, which were excluding cruise missiles, right? So we're putting aside the stuff that's obviously maneuverable. The majority of those missiles were maneuverable, right? So the majority of things that people are talking about with respect to ballistic are actually maneuverable. And to me, this isn't, I think some people could say, oh, well, fine, this is a semantics issue. Maybe the definition of ballistic and all these different and all these different fora, they define it ballistic this way, but everyone kind of knows that ballistic can mean, as long as it's, sort of parabolic, that, can be maneuverable. But that's wrong, because when people differentiate hypersonic weapons from ballistic missiles, they keep going to this definition of ballistic. And I actually have a couple quotes for you, if you don't mind. And my old employer, Government Accountability Office, had this line: unlike ballistic missiles, which can reach similar speeds but have a relatively fixed flight path, hypersonic weapons, ... The Congressional Research Service: Unlike ballistic missiles, hypersonic weapons do not follow ballistic trajectory and can maneuver en route to their destination. Everybody gets this wrong. I picked GAO and CRS because I know how much work goes into every word that they publish, right? So if they're getting it wrong, everybody's getting it wrong. One of my a recent one that I saw, Atlantic Council had a primer on hypersonic weapons, and they wrote, ICBMs follow a predictable trajectory, so a target can be discerned after a launch is detected. I just mentioned you could have with an ICBM since the 70s,
Sure.
50 years. You have the same missile. You could have one reentry vehicle headed to Atlanta and one to New York. So how in the world is a target been discerned after launch, right? Like that's just not true. So, it's this problem of we just are failing to appreciate that, a lot of the missile environment is behaving in this way that we're finding so threatening because of these categories that I think we've assigned to them, and to make it easier to understand. And it's really, I think it's hurting the conversation.
Sure. So what would you then say is the solution?
I think we should try to understand that missiles are a spectrum rather than fit into neat categories, right? And I think maneuverability is a spectrum, and it may be that glide vehicles, hypersonic glide vehicles, hypersonic scramjet systems are kind of one end of that spectrum, but we should stop. I think and I just had a paper about missile warning and tracking, the defense budget, and you're seeing there's just so much emphasis everywhere on the word hypersonic, but again, just a lot of these other systems are really, really scary, and we're just not giving those as much attention in the press. We're not giving those as much attention in the public debate, and I think that again, it kind of then it pushes people back to this problem I spoke about in the beginning, where you have this hypersonic missile debate that's all about strategic assumptions, and we're not getting to the technical questions, right? The technical questions that we want to pull on, and are there categories of maneuverability that we should be thinking about rather than just sort of saying ballistic versus cruise versus hypersonic? I think getting a more sophisticated understanding of what different what does how much maneuverability is really concerning to us from a theater perspective, from a strategic, from a homeland perspective. Trying to get a more nuanced conversation, I think, is really important.
I guess as I think about it, what I think probably worries, on the, on your right side of the spectrum, is this growing challenge of what I have a collaborator that we've written several articles about, this challenge of what we call attack time compression, where you have shrinking times to detect, decide, and direct your forces to respond. And hypersonic glide vehicles, which, you're going to detect the thermal from, SIBRs or other space assets. You may be able to track to some degree, but, you have some maneuverability that gives quite a bit of variation in a short period of time. Whereas, like you said, there is some maneuverability in what we think of as traditional ballistic systems, but we sort of have more ability to kind of think where we think they're going to go. I've sat in the Missile Warning Center and watched projected tracks myself, and there's a sense of comfort, I think, that you get when you think where even if you're going to be destroyed, you at least feel more comfortable knowing where it's going. And so there's a level of discomfort with the idea that you have shorter amounts of time to try to, detect, decide, and direct for a system that can move hundreds of miles in a matter of a few seconds, and you've got questions in your systems of survivability and your ability to create dual phenomenology and some of these things that we've sort of grown up over time in the nuclear world that give us the comfort and sort of assuage the concerns of particularly leadership in Congress and the White House. And now it seems to be creating more uncertainty than I think we're obviously comfortable with. And I wonder how we address that challenge.
It's a great question. I think this point is critical, right? I mean, I and this is why I dislike some of the discourse around hypersonic weapons, that it's this sort of, it's an arms race, or it's something, like whether it's like some people say it's a self-inflicted arms race, or some people say that, this is the race to the future. Well, what's missing is that, fast maneuverable missiles are scary because of exactly what you said. Decision makers are forced to make really consequential decisions with really imperfect information, right? Like, say to the president, hey, we detected a boost or 5 boosts, but we don't know where they're headed, or here's the circle of where all this could go. That's really scary. The thing I would challenge you on is that I think with a lot of the systems that we're talking about that are called ballistic, the circle is still really, really big. And that's where my issue is. This problem exists absolutely with hypersonic glide vehicles, but it exists for a lot of other systems that we're not calling glide vehicles. We're not calling cruise missiles, right? We're calling ballistic missiles. And I mean, again, the ICBM one is an obvious one. But I mean, again, with some of these maneuverable reentry vehicles are getting more and more sophisticated, that the lines between what you call a glide vehicle and what you call a MARV and a ballistic MARV system is like, be my guest trying to split those, because I just think it's really, really hard, and a lot of the and we don't, right? Like in our paper, in our missile taxonomy paper, we don't. We say these are systems. Hypersonic systems could be systems that simply just maneuver aerodynamically, or they could be systems that have propulsive maneuverability and can maneuver aerodynamically. But there's other systems that can maneuver aerodynamically, and there's other systems that can maneuver impulsive, like they have impulsive propulsion to like ICBMs with multiple independent reentry vehicles. So I think this challenge is really, really important and keeps getting ignored. But I just don't think it's limited to glide vehicles and scramjet.
Yeah, and one of the big current concerns for me is that as we think about hypersonics, and I do think there's some new characteristics, and anything new is presents uncertainty and fear. But I don't want to lose track of low observables, because we have challenges like the Russians can fly their bombers, close to the edge of their airspace, and they can launch low observable cruise missiles that can fly into U.S. airspace largely undetected and begin striking targets. And so we still have a low observable problem that we have to address. And so, hypersonics, it's a challenge, it's new, but it's not the only challenge, and it's not the only problem. And, quantum computing, if that becomes the reality that we're often led to believe, that could present challenges that go far beyond anything that we expect to see with hypersonic vehicles. So I agree with you. It's new in some ways, it's old in some ways, but we have lots of other things we still have to think about.
Yeah. I just think you're right. There are new characteristics, but it's more of a spectrum, and I think once we can get there, then we can start thinking about some of the areas of that spectrum that are more concerning than others, and that then gets to some of the characteristics that are more concerning to us than others, and we can try to unpack that. And I think that's the right approach, rather than sort of what's happening in the public debate now. But on the flip side, now we're embarking on this new missile warning and tracking architecture that is partly thinking about this problem of how can we try to give more information to decision makers. And this is obviously really challenging because the entire mission of missile warning was always missile warning, not missile tracking, right? It was missile warning because we detected the boost, and then we could figure out where it's headed, right? And so now with these new proposals, these new architectures, and I had a paper out just a month ago or 2 months ago about the missile warning tracking architecture and some of the debates within Congress and the budget request from the administration. But I think that's a critical area for space right now, for DoD space, and it's going to be an area of intense interest for the next several years. Partly because this area is so important. You have the Secretary of the Air Force, Frank Kendall, writing an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal about missile warning and tracking. But it occupies a huge percentage of the budget for the Space Force, and it's also it's also kind of teasing out this idea of what does a defendable architecture mean, and how for critical space missions, missile warning and tracking clearly being at the top of the list. What does a resilient architecture look like? What does a defendable architecture look like? What does that cost? Right? What are the trade-offs? So all those are kind of coming. All those issues are wrapped up in this missile conversation. And it's a really fascinating issue. This area with so much change. Even though I was just saying that some of these things that we've been scared about, have existed for 50, 60 years. It's also, I think, a topic that is undergoing serious change.
Unfortunately, we are out of time. So it was a quick 35 minutes. So I want to thank Sam Wilson for being my guest today. We had a great talk about hypersonics and some of the misnomers, and maybe reorienting the way we think about missiles in general. And so thanks for being with us, Sam.
Adam, really, it was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, and we'll see you next time on Nuclecast. Well, we just had a great interview with Sam Wilson of the Aerospace Corporation. Our topic, hypersonic weapons. Now, what was interesting is Sam has done an analysis of sort of where everybody in DC stands on these issues. And he created 4 essential camps. The get ahead camp, that would sort of be in nuclear terms, your maximalist camp. The shields up camp, that's sort of your missile defense advocates. Your draw the line, which would be generally passive defenses, and then your avoid the race, which would be where many of your advocates of disarmament would stand. And so that was an interesting discussion. We also talked about some myths that many Americans and many in the strategic community have about missiles writ large, and it turned out to be a really interesting conversation. And so I thought it was pretty good, and hopefully you'll enjoy it too.